They stripped her naked at the altar on the coldest morning of the year, and not one person in that cathedral moved to stop it. If you have ever felt the particular cruelty of being destroyed in public by the very people who swore to love you, then you already know what Alara Voss felt in the first moment the fabric of her wedding gown was torn from her shoulders. That strange, suspended silence before the shame arrives, when the mind simply refuses to accept what the body already knows. Before we go any further into the story, I want to ask all of you watching right now, where are you watching from today? Drop your city, your country, your little corner of the world in the comments below, because this story belongs to everyone who has ever been made to feel worthless by someone who simply didn't deserve the power they held over them. And if this kind of storytelling moves something in you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to this channel, because we are just getting started. Now, let us go back to the beginning. It was the 14th of December, in the year of our Lord 1843, and St. Cuthbert's Cathedral in London had never looked more magnificent. Every pew was filled. Candles lined the nave in columns of trembling gold light. The smell of hothouse roses, white ones Alara's choice, drifted through the cold stone air, and outside, a thin December snow had begun to fall, as though the world itself were dressing for the occasion. Alara Voss stood at the entrance to the nave and thought that she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. She was 23 years old. She had pale gold hair that her maid had spent 3 hours arranging beneath a veil of Brussels lace. Her gown was ivory silk with seed pearls along the bodice, commissioned from the finest dressmaker in Mayfair, paid for, as everything in Alara's life had been paid for these past 4 years, by her uncle, Lord Edmund Voss, who stood just behind her left shoulder now, his hand resting at the small of her back with the particular pressure of a man who owns something. She told herself she was simply nervous, that the tightness in her chest was ordinary bridal anxiety, that the way Edmund's hand sat against her spine, proprietorial cold, was simply her imagination reading cruelty into ordinary gesture. She had told herself many such things over the years. The organ began. 200 heads turned, and Alara Voss walked toward the altar where Lord Gerald Harwick stood waiting, his face arranged into an expression that she had always read as pride and would, before the morning was finished, understand was something else entirely. Gerald Harwick was 38 years old, a baron of moderate fortune and a moderate social ambition, with pale eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He had courted Alara for 11 months, with all the patient calculation of a man who had identified exactly what he wanted and was simply waiting for the correct moment to take it. He had been charming. He had been attentive. He had sent flowers and poetry and appeared at precisely the right events, and Alara, who had not been permitted many opportunities to meet eligible men under the watchful management of her uncle, had been grateful for his attention in the way that isolated people are always grateful to be seen. She had not loved him. She had understood, in the private honesty of her own heart, that what she felt for Gerald was something closer to relief than affection. But she had been 22, and Edmund had made it quietly, consistently clear that a woman in her position, an orphan, dependent on his charity, subject to his authority until she married, did not have the luxury of waiting for love. So she had said yes, and she had spent 11 months convincing herself that yes was enough. She reached the altar. Gerald took her hands. The bishop opened his book, and Alara looked into her betrothed's pale eyes and saw, for the first time, that there was something terrible waiting there. She did not understand it yet. The ceremony began. The words flowed over her, the familiar cadence of the marriage rite, the promises of honor and love and cherishing, and she repeated her responses in a clear, quiet voice, because she had been raised to maintain composure above all things, and because some part of her still believed that what she had seen in Gerald's eyes was only her own fear reflected back at her. It was when the bishop reached the vows, when he asked Gerald Harwick if he took this woman to be his lawful wedded wife, that the morning broke open. Gerald released her hands. He stepped back, and he turned to face the assembled congregation with an expression that Alara would spend years afterward trying to find adequate language for. It was not anger, exactly. It was not disgust, though both of those things lived inside it. It was the expression of a man performing a long-rehearsed act who is satisfied that his audience is paying sufficient attention. "I will not," Gerald said. His voice carried easily through the cathedral. It was a voice accustomed to being heard. "And I will explain to this company precisely why." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Alara had ever experienced. What came next happened with a speed and choreography that told her, even in her shock, that it had been planned, that every movement had been practiced, that she had walked into this cathedral not as a bride but as a subject, and that what was about to be done to her had been arranged with the same careful attention to detail that one might apply to an execution. Two of Gerald's men appeared from the side aisle, large men, full men perhaps, though not in any livery she recognized. Edmund's hand closed around her arm from behind, and Gerald began to speak. He spoke of her character. He used words that she had never heard applied to herself, words that landed like stones, cold and hard and intended to wound. He spoke of letters, of alleged conduct, of a reputation he claimed that made her unfit to bear his name. He spoke with the confidence of a man who has prepared his evidence and knows that the crowd will believe the performance over the person standing mute before them. And as he spoke, Edmund's men took hold of the back of her gown. She felt the first tear of fabric and did not believe it. The mind is merciful in that way. It refuses, for a moment, to accept the reality of the unacceptable. She turned to look at her uncle and saw that he was watching Gerald with an expression of mild approval, as though observing a business transaction proceeding according to plan. "Edmund," she said. Only his name, only one word, but everything she had ever trusted him with was inside it. He did not look at her. The gown came away in pieces. The veil, the pearls along the bodice, scattering across the marble floor like small white moons. Beneath she wore only her underpinnings, thin cotton, wholly inadequate against the December cold that poured through the cathedral's great stone walls. Around her, 200 people sat in frozen silence, and not one of them rose. Not one voice spoke in her defense. Not one hand reached toward her. She stood in the ruins of her wedding gown, in the ruins of the morning, in the ruins of everything she had believed her life was building toward. And she did not weep. She could not have said afterward whether that was strength or simply shock. But she stood straight, and she kept her eyes open, and she looked at Gerald Harwick with absolute clarity. "You will regret this," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically. Simply the truth, stated with the quiet conviction of a woman who has just discovered, in the worst possible way, exactly who she is. Gerald smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Remove her," he said. They put her out through the cathedral's side door, not even the great front entrance, but the small servants' passage that opened onto a narrow street, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a judge's gavel, and the December snow fell softly onto her bare shoulders, and Alara Voss stood alone in the cold and finally allowed herself to understand that everything she had thought was her life had been a very carefully constructed lie. She had no coat, no money, no gloves. The silk slippers on her feet were already soaking through with snowmelt. She began to walk. She did not know where she was going. She knew only that she could not stand still, because standing still meant acknowledging the full weight of what had just happened, and she was not certain she could carry that weight and remain standing. So she walked, one foot in front of the other, through the narrow London streets, while above her the December sky pressed down gray and cold and indifferent, and the snow kept falling, as though the world had decided to bury her quietly and without ceremony. She had walked perhaps 4 streets when the carriage appeared. It was black, with no visible insignia on the door, a deliberate absence, she would later understand, chosen specifically so that she would not refuse it out of pride. It stopped beside her, and the door opened, and no one spoke. But inside was a heavy wool blanket and a pair of soft leather gloves and a small card, on which 3 words were written in a hand she had not seen in 10 years, but recognized immediately, as though her memory had been keeping it safe all this time. "You are not alone." She looked up at the coachman. He looked forward, his face impassive, offering neither explanation nor pressure. She thought of the cathedral behind her, of the white roses, of the pearls scattered across the marble floor. She thought of the handwriting on the card, and she climbed into the carriage. He had arrived at St. Cuthbert's Cathedral that morning with no intention of staying. Caspian Devereux, the 8th Duke of Ashmore, had a great many demands on his time and an equally great many reasons to avoid the social performances that London's aristocracy mistook for civilization. He attended balls when politics required it, dinners when alliances demanded it, and weddings almost never, for weddings, in his experience, were exercises in collective self-deception, wherein two people who had negotiated a contract dressed the arrangement in silk and flowers and asked God to bless what was, at its core, a transaction. He had made an exception this morning for one reason only. He had heard that Alara Voss was to be married. He had told himself in the rational privacy of his own mind that he attended out of nothing more than old acquaintance. He and Alara had known each other as children. Their fathers had been friends, and there had been summers at the Voss estate in Wiltshire, long golden summers that belonged to another life entirely, before death and duty and the grinding machinery of English inheritance had remade them both into different people. He had not seen her in 10 years. He owed her nothing. He simply wanted, in some way he had never subjected to close examination, to see that she was well. He had taken a seat in the upper gallery, away from the assembled families and their careful social arrangements, in the shadows beneath one of the cathedral's great stone arches. From there he had a clear view of the entire nave. He had watched the candles. He had watched the roses. He had watched the door at the far end of the cathedral with the focused patience of a man who does not permit himself to acknowledge why he is watching it. And then Alara had appeared. 10 years. A decade of silence and distance, and the deliberate construction of a life that had no room for sentiment. And yet the moment he saw her at the entrance to the nave, pale gold hair, ivory silk, her spine absolutely straight, her chin lifted in a way he remembered from childhood as her particular response to anything that frightened her, Caspian felt something shift in his chest with the quiet, irrevocable finality of a lock turning. She looked, he thought, like a woman walking into battle. He had not understood, then, how precisely accurate that observation was. He watched the ceremony begin. He watched Harwick take her hands, and this was the moment when the cold thing that lived in Caspian's chest first began to heat. He watched Harwick release them. He saw the step backward. He saw the turn toward the congregation. And he read, in the geometry of that movement, the entire architecture of what was about to happen before a single word was spoken. He was on his feet before Gerald Harwick opened his mouth. He did not go down to the nave. He understood, with a tactical clarity that had served him well in both politics and personal affairs, that any intervention he made in the moment would be used against her, that a duke descending from the gallery to defend a woman whose gown was being torn from her body would become, in the mouths of London society, a scandal of a different but equally damaging kind. He understood that the damage being done was precisely calibrated, and that it required a response of equal precision. So he stood in the shadow of the stone arch, and he watched, and he made himself observe every detail with the cold attention of a man cataloguing evidence, rather than a man watching something that was tearing him quietly to pieces. He watched the fabric come away. He watched Edmund Voss's face, that expression of mild approval, that careful distance, the face of a man who has arranged a piece of business and is satisfied with its execution. He watched Harwick perform his speech with the fluency of rehearsal. He watched 200 people sit in silence and do nothing. He memorized every face. When they put her out through the side door, he was already moving. He did not follow her directly. He descended from the gallery by the back stairs, his mind already 3 steps ahead, already constructing the shape of what needed to happen next. He found his secretary, Aldous, waiting in the vestibule with the particular expression of a man who has also seen something he cannot quite believe and is awaiting instruction. "The carriage," Caspian said. "No insignia. Send Martin. He knows the streets east of the cathedral. She'll walk east. She was always more comfortable away from the main thoroughfares." He paused. "Blanket. Gloves. And tell Martin not to speak unless spoken to." Aldous, who had served Caspian for 11 years and possessed both excellent judgment and the wisdom to deploy it quietly, said only, "The card, Your Grace." Caspian was already writing it. He handed it over without looking up. 3 words. He had written them without thinking, which told him something about the territory he was entering that he chose, for the moment, not to examine. "Go," he said. Now. Aldous went. Caspian stood alone in the vestibule of St. Cuthbert's Cathedral, while above him the organ resumed playing. Some processional chosen for a wedding that was no longer occurring, the notes drifting down through the stone like something grief-stricken, and he stood very still and allowed himself, for precisely 30 seconds, to feel the full weight of what he had just witnessed. Then he put it away, not because it didn't matter, because it mattered enormously, which was precisely why he needed to be clear-headed. He had work to do. He did not go home immediately. He went instead to his club, not for the brandy, though he accepted a glass when it was offered, but for the information that moved through those rooms like blood through a body, constant and revealing. He found Lord Pemberton at his usual corner table and sat across from him without waiting for an invitation, which was the particular privilege of dukes and men who had once pulled Pemberton out of a significant financial difficulty without mentioning it afterward. Pemberton looked at him with the wariness of a man who reads moods well. "You were there," Caspian said. It was not a question. "I was," Pemberton said carefully. "Tell me what you know about Harwick's finances." Pemberton was quiet for a moment. He was not a bad man, merely a cautious one, which in London society often amounted to the same thing. He looked at his brandy. He looked at Caspian. And apparently something in Caspian's expression settled the question for him. "Harwick has been leveraged to the point of collapse for the better part of 2 years, Pemberton said, lowering his voice. "Bad investments. A property in Scotland that turned out to be worth roughly half what he paid for it. He needed the Voss fortune badly." A pause. Needed it, and apparently found a way to obtain it without the inconvenience of actually marrying the woman. Caspian set down his glass with great precision. "Explain." "I don't know the legal details. But there's been talk for weeks, in certain circles, that Edmund Voss and Harwick have some arrangement regarding the inheritance. Something about the terms of the original Voss estate. If Alara was publicly discredited before the marriage was completed." Pemberton stopped. Shook his head slightly. "I'm speculating." "Speculate more precisely," Caspian said. Pemberton looked at him for a long moment. "If she was discredited, declared unfit, placed under some form of legal guardianship as a result, her uncle's guardianship, let us say, then the fortune never leaves Edmund's control at all. The marriage was never the goal." Another pause, quieter. She was always just the mechanism. The cold thing in Caspian's chest had become something else entirely. It had a temperature now. It had a direction. He finished his brandy and stood. "Caspian," Pemberton said, and the use of his given name, from a man who almost never used it, made him stop. "Whatever you're considering, be careful. Edmund Voss has friends in the Lord Chancellor's office, and Harwick is vindictive in ways that are not always visible until the damage is already done." "Thank you, Pemberton," Caspian said. "I mean it. Be careful." Caspian looked at him. "I am always careful," he said. "I am also, when the occasion demands it, entirely without mercy. Those two things are not mutually exclusive." He left the club and drove to Ashenmore Hall, which occupied a significant portion of the most desirable street in Mayfair, and communicated, through its sheer architectural confidence, that the family who owned it had been doing so long enough to have stopped feeling the need to prove anything to anyone. His housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, met him in the entrance hall with the expression of a woman who has already received instructions she found surprising and is waiting to see if they will be confirmed. "The East Wing guest suite," Caspian said. "Have it prepared. Fire in every room. Have cook send up whatever she thinks appropriate for someone who has been standing in December cold for an indeterminate period with insufficient clothing." He paused. "And Mrs. Crane, whoever arrives in my carriage this evening is to be treated with every courtesy afforded to a guest of this house. Without exception. Without comment. without the particular brand of curiosity that spreads from a household into the street. Mrs. Crane, who was 61 years old and had managed Ashenmore Hall for 23 of them and had, accordingly, seen a great many things, simply said, "Of course, Your Grace." He went to his study. He lit the lamp. He sat at the desk where he managed the considerable business of being a duke and pulled forward a fresh sheet of paper. He began to make a list. The list had 2 columns. The first was headed "What is known." The second was headed "What must be established." He worked with methodical focus, the kind that had served him in Parliament and in the management of 4 estates, and in every situation life had presented him with that required clarity in place of feeling. But beneath the methodology, beneath the careful columns and the precise handwriting, something was burning. He had stood in that gallery and watched Alara Voss stand straight in the ruins of her wedding gown and say, "You will regret this," in a voice that did not shake. And he had felt something he had not permitted himself to feel in a very long time. Not since he was 18 years old and had stood at the gates of the Voss estate in Wiltshire and looked back at a girl who was watching him leave with an expression that he had spent 10 years telling himself he had misread. He had not misread it. He had simply been 20 years old, and without a dukedom yet, and her father had still been alive, and Edmund Voss had already been positioning himself as the arbiter of Alara's future, and Caspian had made the choice, the careful, rational, terribly wrong choice, to leave and establish himself first, to build something worthy of offering her before he offered anything at all. He had taken too long. He would not take too long again. He wrote until the candle burned low, and then he rang for another, and he kept writing. Outside, the December snow continued to fall over London, and somewhere in the city his carriage was moving through it, carrying toward him the one person he had spent 10 years trying to deserve. He would be ready. He would be worthy now, or he would burn everything down trying. She had expected pity. That was the thing Alara could not quite reconcile as the carriage moved through the snow-quieted streets of London, carrying her toward a destination she had not asked about and a host she had not yet allowed herself to fully believe in. She had expected pity because pity was what the world offered women in her position. That particular blend of sympathy and condescension that made the recipient feel simultaneously seen and diminished, that communicated, beneath its surface warmth, "How fortunate that someone like me has noticed someone like you." She had received pity from Edmund for 4 years, and she knew its texture intimately. She knew how it held you at arm's length even as it pulled you close. She knew how it always came with a price. The carriage was warm. The blanket was thick and smelled faintly of cedar and something else she couldn't identify, something clean and serious, like cold air and old books. The gloves were fine leather, lined with silk, and they fit well enough that she wondered, briefly and then not briefly at all, whether that was accident or intention. She did not look at the card again. She had read it once, and once had been enough. She held the words in her mind instead, turning them carefully, the way you turn something fragile to check for cracks. "You are not alone." 3 words. She had spent the better part of 4 years being alone, not in the physical sense, for Edmund's house was always full of people, staff and associates, and the particular parade of visitors that men of business attract, but in the way that matters, in the way that has nothing to do with the number of bodies in a room and everything to do with whether a single one of them sees you. She had been managed and directed and displayed and traded, and through all of it she had been profoundly, architecturally alone, and she had made her peace with that the way you make peace with a wound that won't fully heal, by simply deciding not to press on it. 3 words, and something inside her that she had spent years carefully calcifying cracked straight through. She pressed her gloved hands together in her lap and breathed and did not weep. She had come very close to weeping, once, in the narrow street outside the cathedral, with the snow falling on her bare shoulders and the sound of the cathedral door still ringing in her memory like a verdict. She had come close, and then she had thought of Gerald Harwick's smile, and something had hardened in her instead of breaking, and she had begun to walk. She was still grateful for that hardness now. She thought she might need it. Ashenmore Hall announced itself first through the quality of the street, the particular hush of Mayfair, the wider pavements, the houses that did not merely stand but presided, and then through its own gates, which were tall and iron and bore no unnecessary ornamentation. as though the house beyond them had nothing to prove. The carriage passed through and drew up before an entrance portico lit by 2 lanterns, their flames steady and warm in the snow-filled dark. A housekeeper appeared at the top of the steps before the carriage had fully stopped. She was a compact woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair and an expression of complete, composed welcome that communicated, without a single word of unnecessary reassurance, that whatever had happened before this moment was no one's business here. "Miss Voss," she said, when the footman had handed Alara down. "I am Mrs. Crane, housekeeper of Ashimore Hall. Please come inside out of a cold." No exclamation at her state of dress. No visible reaction to the ruined underpinnings, the soaked slippers, the remnants of Brussels lace still caught in her hair. Simply, "Please come inside out of the cold," as though Alara's presence here were entirely expected. As though dignity were not something to be earned back, but something she had simply always possessed, and was merely being invited to reclaim. Alara followed her inside. The entrance hall was everything the exterior had promised. High ceilings, stone floors covered with deep rugs, a staircase that curved upward with the graceful confidence of something built by people who expected it to last for centuries. A fire burned in the hall grate, enormous and extravagant and perfect. Alara stopped in front of it before she could stop herself, and she stood with her hands extended toward the heat, and she let herself, for just one moment, simply be warm. His Grace anticipated you might need some time before receiving anyone, Mrs. Crane said from somewhere behind her. The East Wing suite has been prepared. There is a bath drawn, and cook has sent up a tray. There is also clothing. My niece is near your height, and she has left several things with us that I think will serve for this evening. Alara turned. His Grace is not. He is in his study, Mrs. Crane said, with a particular smoothness of a woman who has navigated the social architecture of a duke's household for decades. He has left word that you are to have whatever you need, and that there is absolutely no obligation on your part to see anyone tonight, including himself, if you would prefer to rest. He said, a brief pause, and something in Mrs. Crane's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly toward warmth. He said to tell you that the house is yours to move through as you like, and that explanations can wait for morning. Alara looked at this woman who owed her nothing, standing in the hallway of a house that had no reason to take her in, delivering a message from a man she had not spoken to in 10 years, and she felt the crack inside her widen another fraction. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. A bath would be very welcome. The East Wing suite was 3 rooms, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a small dressing room, all of them quietly, seriously comfortable in the way that old money decorates when it is not performing for anyone. Deep colors, worn well. Furniture that invited use rather than observation. The fire in the bedroom had already been burning long enough that the room was genuinely warm, not merely aspirationally so. And the bath that waited in the dressing room steamed with the lavender and rosemary scent of someone who had thought carefully about what a woman recovering from a catastrophe might need. She stayed in the bath until the water cooled, and then she stayed a little longer. She allowed herself, in that private steam-softened space, to think about the morning in pieces rather than all at once. It was the only way she could manage it. She thought about the cathedral, and she breathed through the wave of it. She thought about Gerald's face, and the way he had turned from her to address the congregation, and the particular quality of her uncle's silence. She thought about the fabric tearing. She thought about the marble floor and the pearls scattered across it, and 200 people who had sat without moving. And then she thought about 3 words on a small white card, and the blanket that smelled of cedar and gloves that fit, and a housekeeper who had not looked at her with pity, but with simple, steady welcome. She thought, someone sent a carriage before he knew whether I would get in. She thought, someone prepared a room before I arrived. She dressed in the borrowed clothing, a plain wool dress in deep blue, slightly large through the shoulders but warm and clean, and she sat at the small table in the sitting room and ate what cook had sent up, which was soup and bread and a piece of apple tart. And she ate all of it with the focused determination of someone who understands that grief can wait, but the body cannot. She was sitting with her second cup of tea, the fire burning low, the snow falling past the dark window in a soft, continuous curtain, when the knock came. It was not Mrs. Crane. She knew that from the sound of it. Quieter than efficiency, more deliberate than urgency. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, and then silence. The knock of someone who is genuinely prepared to be turned away. She set down her cup. She looked at the door. She thought about the girl she had been at 13, sitting in the grass in Wiltshire with a boy who had brought her a book of star charts, and explained each constellation with the serious enthusiasm of someone who has recently discovered that the universe is even larger than he suspected, and who had wanted immediately to share this alarming and wonderful information with the one person he thought would understand it. "Come in," she said. The door opened, and Caspian Devereux stepped into the room, and 10 years collapsed like paper. He was taller than she remembered, though she supposed she had been 13, and he had still been growing. He was broad through the shoulders now, and there was a quality to the way he occupied space. Not aggressive, not performative, simply certain, the way old trees are certain, that she did not recall from the boy she had known, but could see was the direct inheritance of that boy's particular stillness. His hair was dark, his eyes were the same gray she remembered, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately name, though it was nothing remotely like pity. He stopped a few feet inside the door and did not come closer. "Ilara," he said. "Just her name. Not Miss Voss. Her name, the one she had had before Edmund and Gerald and all their careful management. The one that belonged to the girl in the grass with the star charts." "Caspian," she said. A pause. Outside, the snow fell. The fire settled. "I won't ask you how you are," he said. "It seems a foolish question under the circumstances." Something moved through her. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, but something that lived in the territory between them. "It would be," she agreed. He moved then, not toward her, but to the chair nearest the fireplace, the one slightly farther from her own, positioned so that she could see him clearly without having to turn or feel enclosed. He sat with the ease of someone who has thought about where to put himself and made a deliberate choice. And he looked at her with those gray eyes that had always, she remembered now, been capable of seeing more than she intended to show. "You don't have to say anything tonight," he said. "About any of it. You don't have to explain yourself or account for yourself or make sense of anything that happened this morning. There will be time for all of that." A pause. I wanted to see that you were here. That you were warm." She looked at him. "You sent the carriage before you knew I would get in." "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for words, but the quiet of someone who has many words and is deciding which ones are appropriate for right now, tonight, in this room, when she is still fragile in ways she won't fully discover until later. "Because I know you," he said finally. "And I know that you would walk in the snow in your underpinnings before you would ask for help from someone who offered it with conditions attached. So I tried to make it easy to accept." A pause. "There are no conditions, Ilara. Not one." She had been holding herself together all day with the focused tension of someone carrying something heavy across difficult ground, and those words, "not one," landed on something structural inside her, something that had been bearing too much weight for too long. She felt it in her sternum first, and then behind her eyes, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the window, and breathed carefully. "I won't fall apart," she said. It was unclear whether she was telling him or herself. "You can if you need to," he said. "I won't think less of you. I would think significantly less of any person who watched what you endured this morning and didn't eventually fall apart, at least slightly." She breathed again. The snow fell. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 10. "I want to understand what they did," she said quietly. "All of it. I want to understand the whole of it, not just the part they showed me." "You will," he said. "I promise you that. But not tonight." He stood, and she noticed that he moved to the door rather than toward her, maintaining that careful distance that she was beginning to understand was not indifference, but the opposite, a precise and deliberate respect for the particular vulnerability of this particular night. "Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we begin." He reached the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, his back still 3/4 toward her, and she thought he was going to say something more. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, as though checking that she was real, that she was here, that this was not something he had to let go of again. "Caspian," she said. He turned slightly. "Thank you," she said. for the carriage, for the gloves, a breath, for the 3 words. Something shifted in his expression, brief and unguarded, like light through a closing door. "Get some rest," he said. And then he was gone, and the door was closed, and Alara sat alone in the warm room with the snow falling past the window and the fire breathing softly beside her. And she thought that she had not felt this particular quality of safety, the kind with no conditions attached, in so long that she had forgotten what it felt like in her body. It felt, she decided, like finally being able to breathe all the way down. She went to bed, and she slept, and she did not dream of the cathedral. She dreamed of Wiltshire, of summer, of a boy with a book of star charts, pointing up at a sky full of impossible light. The truth, Alara would discover, was worse than she had imagined. And she had imagined quite a lot, lying awake in the gray December dawn, listening to the house breathe around her and constructing, with the methodical precision of someone who has always preferred knowledge to comfortable ignorance, every possible version of what had been done to her and why. She had suspected Edmund. She had suspected him for years in the vague, unexamined way that you suspect something you cannot afford to look at directly, a peripheral knowledge, held at the edge of conscious thought, allowed to exist only as long as it remained unconfirmed. Edmund had taken her in at 19, after her father's death, with an air of such magnanimous duty that she had been, God help her, grateful. He had managed her father's estate with what he described as painstaking care. He had introduced her to society with what he described as considerable personal sacrifice. He had directed every significant decision of her adult life with the smooth, unassailable authority of a man who has arranged things so completely in his own favor that any challenge to his authority appears, on its surface, as ingratitude. She had been grateful. She had been compliant. She understood now in the cold December morning with her borrowed blue wool dress, and her cup of tea, and her fury building slow and architectural beneath her sternum, precisely what he had needed her to be. Caspian came to the sitting room at 9 o'clock, preceded by Mrs. Crane with a breakfast tray of a generosity that suggested cook had strong feelings about people who had missed dinner the night before. He was dressed for the day already, dark coat, no ornamentation, the clothing of a man who has work to do and dresses accordingly. And he carried with him a leather satchel that he set on the table beside the breakfast things with a care that told her it contained something significant. He waited until she had eaten before he opened it. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. "I want to show you what I have found," he said, "and I want to be honest with you about the parts one have not yet confirmed. There's a difference between what I know and what I suspect, and you deserve to understand which is which." "Tell me all of it," she said. He told her. He began with the financial architecture, the dry, structural bones of it, the legal framework within which Edmund and Gerald had constructed their scheme. Her father, Sir William Voss, had died 4 years ago, leaving an estate valued at approximately £80,000, comprised of the Wiltshire property, several London investments, and a not inconsiderable sum in consolidated funds. The will had left everything to Alara outright, with Edmund named as executor and trustee until her marriage or her 25th birthday, whichever came first. She had known this broadly. She had not known the specific terms of the trustee arrangement, had not been shown the actual document, had simply been told its broad conclusions by Edmund himself, and had accepted his summary because she had not yet learned the particular lesson that the powerful teach the powerless only the portions of the truth that serve the powerful's purposes. "The trust document," Caspian said, laying a paper on the table between them, "contains a clause that your uncle almost certainly added after your father's death, during the probate process. It may have been added with the collusion of the solicitor who handled the estate. I am still establishing that. The clause states that if prior to marriage or her 25th birthday, the beneficiary is found to be of compromised moral character, the term used is publicly disgraced, the trustee retains authority over the estate in perpetuity until such time as a court determines otherwise." Alara looked at the document. The words were dense and technical and deliberately so, the kind of legal language designed not to illuminate but to obscure. But she was a careful reader, and she found the clause, and she read it twice. "He added this," she said. "Almost certainly. Before or after he found Harwick, Caspian's expression told her that she had arrived at exactly the right question. That is what I am still determining. My suspicion, and it is a suspicion not yet confirmed, is that the clause came first. That Edmund spent some time after your father's death constructing the legal mechanism, and then spent some additional time finding a man willing and desperate enough to serve as the instrument. She set the document down with great precision. Gerald needed money. Gerald was drowning in debt. The Harwick estate has been deteriorating for years. Bad investments, worse management. He needed a significant infusion of capital, and quickly. And Edmund needed someone to publicly disgrace me. The words sat in the air between them, flat and clear and terrible. Edmund couldn't simply declare me disgraced. That would require evidence, and he had none, because there was nothing to find. He needed someone else to make the accusation, someone with social standing sufficient to make it credible. A baron of established family, in a cathedral full of witnesses, Caspian said quietly. Yes. She stood up. She did not do it dramatically. She simply needed to be upright, needed the physical alignment of standing to process what was settling into her body alongside the breakfast she had just eaten. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where the snow from the night before lay in smooth white sheets across the frozen ground, covering everything with its clean, indifferent blankness. What did Gerald receive? She asked. In return. £20,000 is my current understanding. Paid from your estate, from your money, Ilara, in 2 installments. The first on the day the wedding was announced. The second to be delivered on the day the wedding was publicly dissolved. She closed her eyes. £20,000 from her father's estate, from the money her father had worked and saved and accumulated over a lifetime, with the explicit intention that it should protect her. It had been used, instead, to purchase her destruction. The letters Gerald mentioned, she said. The alleged conduct. The evidence he claimed to have. Fabricated. I am nearly certain. I have someone looking into it. But the timeline is impossible. The dates he implied would require you to have been in places you demonstrably were not. A pause. Edmund gave him a story, and Gerald gave a stage. The specifics were always less important than the spectacle. She opened her eyes. The garden was very white and very still. My 25th birthday, she said slowly, is in March. Yes. She turned from the window to look at him. 3 months from now, the trust expires regardless. The estate passes to me outright. Courts, lawyers, clauses or no clauses. At 25, by the explicit terms of my father's will, I control my own inheritance. Yes, Caspian said, and something in the single syllable told her he had already understood this, had understood it from the beginning, and had let her find her way to it herself rather than presenting it as a conclusion. They couldn't wait, she said. They needed this done before March. If I had simply, she stopped, breathed. If I had simply not married Gerald, if I had simply existed for 3 more months without being publicly discredited, the trust would have expired and Edmund would have lost control of everything. They were running out of time, Caspian confirmed. I believe the wedding was accelerated for exactly this reason. If you look at the original courtship timeline, Harwick's pursuit of you intensified significantly around September, which is approximately when Edmund would have been calculating the March deadline with some urgency. She thought about September. She thought about Gerald's increased attentiveness in the autumn, the additional flowers, the more frequent calls, the gentle but persistent pressure toward a December wedding specifically, when she had once mentioned she had always imagined a spring one. She had attributed it to eagerness, to affection. The word that rose in her now was not a gentle one. What happens, she said carefully, if I am legally declared to be of compromised moral character before March? What happens to the trust? Edmund retains control permanently, or until you successfully challenge the determination in court, which would be difficult. The evidentiary standards for such a challenge are high, and Edmund has friends in the right offices. A pause. He would not need to keep you destitute. He would simply need to maintain control. The income from the estate, the management of the properties, it all remains in his hands. For the rest of his life? Potentially, yes. She stood with the cold light of the December morning on her face and the full, completed shape of what had been done to her finally assembled before her, every piece in its correct and terrible place. And she did something that surprised them both. She laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has finally seen the whole of something they were only permitted to see in pieces, and who finds in the completed picture a kind of savage clarity that is almost indistinguishable from dark humor. It was the laugh of a woman who has just discovered that she was right to be afraid and wrong only about the specific dimensions of the thing she feared. "He is so very thorough," she said. "I will give him that. My uncle is a thorough man." Caspian was watching her with that expression she was beginning to learn, the one that was not quite concern and not quite admiration, but held something of both, along with something else she did not have a name for yet. "Yes," he said. "And Gerald," she continued, "is simply a desperate man who found a use for his desperation. I cannot quite decide which of them I despise more. There is no particular need to rank them. There is sufficient despising available for both." She looked at him. Something eased fractionally in the wire-taut tension of her chest. "What do we do?" He had been waiting for that question. She could see it in the way he straightened slightly, the way his attention sharpened from observation into action. And she thought again of the boy with the star charts who had always known where every constellation was before he pointed it out, who had simply been waiting for the right moment to show her. "3 things," he said. "First, we establish the fraudulent modification of the trust document. If it can be proven that the clause was added after your father's death, the entire legal framework collapses. Second, we establish the financial arrangement between Edmund and Harwick, which transforms this from a private family matter into criminal fraud. Third," he paused, and something moved across his expression, careful and deliberate. "Third, we ensure that you are not legally declared to be of compromised character before March, which means we need to control the social narrative before Edmund and Harwick do." She absorbed this. "The social narrative," she repeated. "You mean London society?" "I mean London society." She looked at him steadily. "Caspian, I was stripped to my underpinnings in the nave of St. Cuthbert's Cathedral in front of 200 members of the aristocracy yesterday morning. I rather think the narrative may have gotten away from us." "The narrative," he said, with a precision that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. The precision of a man who chooses each word the way a chess player chooses each piece, deliberately and with full awareness of its consequences, can always be rewritten. The first version of a story is not always the one that survives. She thought about this. She thought about 200 faces in cathedral pews, and Gerald's rehearsed performance, and the specific quality of silence that follows a spectacle, how it hardens into certainty, how it becomes the version people carry with them, how it gets repeated over dinner tables and in drawing rooms until it loses any connection to the actual event and exists only as social fact. She thought about what it would cost to rewrite it. She thought about March and £80,000 and her father's handwriting on a document he had intended as protection. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need from me." He told her. She listened with complete attention, asking questions where the plan required clarification, pushing back twice on points where she thought his assumptions about Edmund's likely response were optimistic, accepting the amended version when he adjusted his thinking accordingly. They worked through it for 2 hours, there at the breakfast table with the snow outside and the fire burning low beside them. And at no point did he treat her analysis as peripheral or her objections as emotional rather than rational. And she noticed this the way you notice something that should be ordinary and is instead, in your particular experience, extraordinarily rare. When they had finished, she sat back and looked at the papers spread between them. The trust document, Caspian's notes, the beginning of what would become, over the following weeks, a very complete case against 2 very careful men. "There is something I want to ask you," she said. "Ask." She looked at him. "Why? You have no obligation to me. We haven't spoken in 10 years. What is happening here will cost you, socially, politically, perhaps financially. Edmund has allies, and you will make enemies." She paused. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a bird landed in the snow-covered garden and left a small chain of prints across the white surface, and flew away again. "Because what was done to you is wrong," he said, completely and without qualification. "And because I am in a position to do something about it." A pause, brief, but weighted. "And because you are not alone. I told you that yesterday, and I meant it without condition or expiration." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back, steady and clear and utterly without pretense. "All right," she said again, quietly, as though it were a different kind of agreement than the practical one they had just made, as though it were an agreement about something larger, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Outside the window, the snow in the garden sparkled in the thin winter light, sharp and clean, and full of an uncomfortable, clarifying brightness. The work, she thought, was just beginning. Healing, Alara discovered, was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of small survivals. It happened in the days that followed with a quiet persistence of something organic, not dramatic, not linear, but steady in the way that winter light is steady, present even when you cannot feel its warmth. She woke each morning in the East Wing suite and lay still for a moment before the memory of the cathedral returned. And each morning the moment of stillness lasted a fraction longer than the day before, which she took as evidence that something in her was learning, gradually, to exist in the present rather than the wreckage of the recent past. Ashenmore Hall revealed itself to her slowly. It was not a showy house. It did not announce itself or perform for its occupants, but it had a quality of deep, settled comfort that she came to understand was the result of generations of people actually living in it rather than merely displaying themselves within it. The library held books with cracked spines and marginal annotations. The morning room windows had a southern exposure that trapped winter sun with startling efficiency. The kitchen garden, dormant now beneath its cover of snow, had the structural bones of something that would be extraordinary come spring. She was permitted, encouraged even to move through it freely. This, too, was a form of healing she had not anticipated. Edmund's house had operated on the principle of invisible boundaries, rooms that were technically available but atmospherically closed, spaces that communicated through their arrangement that she was a guest in a permanent state of provisional welcome. Here she simply walked where she wanted, sat where the light was good, and was met everywhere with the uncomplicated courtesy of a staff that took their cues from a duke who had made his expectations clear. Caspian himself was careful. It was the word she returned to most often when she tried to articulate, in the privacy of her own thinking, the particular quality of his presence in those first days. Not distant, not formal, but careful in the way of someone who is very aware of what they are handling and very committed to not damaging it further. He appeared at breakfast and sometimes at dinner. He worked through the afternoons in his study, assembling the case against Edmund and Gerald with the methodical focus she was coming to recognize as fundamental to his character. He knocked before entering any room she occupied. He never pressed. But he was there, consistently, without announcement or expectation, simply there. It was on the 5th day that she found the star charts. She had been in the library, following the spines with her fingers in the idle, exploratory way of someone with no particular destination, when she pulled a slender volume from a lower shelf and opened it to find inside the cover, in a boy's careful handwriting, C. Devereux, age 14. Wiltshire, summer. She sat down on the library floor with the book in her lap and turned through it slowly. He had annotated it extensively, not the text itself, but the margins. Small notes, observations, corrections to the author's interpretations, the occasional question posed to no one in particular, and interspersed throughout, in a different pen, evidently added at a later date, small drawings, not of stars or constellations, but of things he had apparently been looking at while he was meant to be looking at the sky. A particular tree, a stone wall, a girl sitting in grass with her chin on her knees. She was looking at this drawing, small, slightly smudged, unmistakably herself, when Caspian appeared in the library doorway. He saw the book. A stillness moved through him that she recognized now as his version of visible emotion. Not absence of feeling, but complete containment of it. Every external signal reduced while the interior work continued. "I forgot that was in here," he said, which she did not entirely believe. "You drew me," she said. "I drew many things that summer." A pause. You were frequently in my field of observation. She looked at the drawing again. The girl in it was 13, angular and serious, chin on knees, looking at something outside the frame with an expression of concentrated attention that was apparently how she had always appeared to him. Not incidentally present, but actively, particularly there. Caspian, she said, without looking up. Why did you leave? The silence that followed had weight and texture. Your uncle, he said finally. Edmund came to my father the August after that summer. I was 20. He made it very clear that my attentions were not welcome, that you were to be managed toward a more suitable arrangement. A pause. My father agreed with him. I had no title yet, no independent income. I had nothing to offer that Edmund could not refuse. She looked up. You could have told me. I know. He did not deflect from it or soften it. I was 20 years old and ashamed of being powerless, and I made the wrong choice. I left without telling you why, and I told myself I would come back when I had something worth offering. His jaw tightened slightly. I took too long. She considered this. The boy who had left without explanation. The girl who had waited without knowing she was waiting, who had gradually, over years, redirected that unnamed waiting into the careful management of survival. How differently everything might have arranged itself with one conversation, one honest word, one refusal to be managed by Edmund Voss. He separated us deliberately, she said. Not a question. Yes. I believe he identified, even then, that I was a variable he couldn't control. Something moved across his expression. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but the compound of both that results from finally understanding the full dimensions of a loss. He was very thorough. Even at 20, he was thorough. She rose from the floor, still holding the book. She crossed the library and held it out to him. He took it, and in the exchange their fingers came very close to touching, and neither of them moved away from that proximity, and the air between them held something that had been building for days, accumulated in every careful knock on a door, and every cup of tea, and every moment of being seen without condition. I want you to know something, she said. She was near enough now that she did not need to speak loudly. What Edmund did, separating us, managing me, arranging Gerald, it was all very deliberate and very calculated. And I spent years inside it, believing that the shape of my life was simply what my life was. She paused. I don't want to spend more years believing that. He was looking at her with an intensity that he was not quite containing anymore. What do you want? He asked. The question was simple and direct and enormous. I want my name back, she said. My inheritance. My father's estate. A breath. And I want, she stopped. Something in her chest that had been locked for a very long time was working at its own mechanism, turning slowly toward open. I want to find out what this is, she said, with a small gesture that encompassed the space between them, without Edmund deciding the answer for me. The firelight moved across his face. Outside the library windows, the December dark had come down early, pressing the warmth inward, making the room smaller and more private than rooms usually manage to be. That seems, he said, with a careful deliberateness that could not quite contain the thing moving underneath it, entirely reasonable. She almost smiled. You are very composed for a man whose childhood drawings have just been discovered. I am, he agreed, exercising considerable self-restraint. And there it was, the first real laugh she had produced since the cathedral, involuntary and genuine, surprised out of her by the perfect dryness of his delivery. It lasted only a moment, but it was real, and she felt it move through her like something loosening, like the first crack in ice at the end of a very long winter. He watched her laugh with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she felt it in her sternum. There, he said softly. There you are. She looked at him. He looked back. And between them, in the firelit library surrounded by books with cracked spines, and one small volume with a drawing of a girl in summer grass, something old and patient and long deferred began, very quietly, to stir. London, in winter, had nothing better to do than talk. This was not a new observation. Ilara had understood the mechanics of society gossip since her first season. had watched it operate with the remorseless efficiency of a well-maintained machine, consuming reputation and producing scandal with equal appetite and no particular regard for truth. She had always been careful to stay outside its reach, to present nothing that could be taken and reshaped, to move through drawing rooms and dinner parties with the pleasant, unremarkable composure of a woman who gives the machine nothing to work with. She understood now that this strategy had always been an illusion. The machine did not require material. It was perfectly capable of manufacturing its own. The first indication that London had found its subject came through Mrs. Crane, who received information from the household networks of Mayfair with the quiet efficiency of a general managing intelligence from the field. On the 8th day of Alara's residence at Ashenmore Hall, Mrs. Crane appeared at the breakfast table with an expression of composed neutrality that Alara had already learned to read as the specific mask the housekeeper wore when delivering unpleasant information she considered the recipient capable of handling. "There's some talk," Mrs. Crane said, addressing herself primarily to Caspian while keeping her peripheral attention on Alara, regarding Miss Voss's presence in the house. Caspian set down his coffee. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that begins as observation and ends as conclusion." A brief pause. "Lady Ashworth held a dinner last evening. Several members of the cathedral congregation were present. The conversation apparently turned at some length to the question of why the Duke of Ashenmore sent a private carriage to collect a publicly disgraced woman from the street within hours of her disgrace. The word landed on the table between them with its full weight. Alara did not flinch. She had decided, sometime in the quiet of the previous night, that she would not permit that word to retain its power through her reaction to it. A word was only a weapon if you handed it back to the person who threw it. "And what conclusions," she asked evenly, "has Lady Ashworth's dinner party reached?" Mrs. Crane's expression flickered with something that might, in a less composed woman, have been appreciation. "Several. None of them flattering to either party." "Of course." She reached for her own coffee. "They think I am his mistress." "Among other theories." "The mistress theory is the charitable one," Caspian said dryly. "The less charitable version suggests I am somehow implicated in the original disgrace, that the entire cathedral performance was arranged to free you for a previously existing arrangement with me." Alara looked at him. "That requires Edmund and Gerald to have been doing me a favor." Society rarely troubles itself with logical consistency. She almost smiled, then didn't, because beyond the dark humor of it lay the genuine and immediate danger. She set down her cup and thought carefully. "How quickly does this kind of talk solidify?" "Quickly," Caspian said. "A week, perhaps 2, before it becomes the established version. After that, correcting it requires significantly more effort than preventing it." He looked at her steadily. "Edmund will be feeding it. He has every interest in ensuring that your presence here is read as confirmation of a character he accused you of." She understood the geometry of it immediately. Every day she remained at Ashenmore Hall without public explanation was a day Edmund's narrative grew stronger. The story he had constructed required her to be exactly the woman Gerald had described in the cathedral, and a woman of compromised character sheltering unchaperoned in a duke's private residence was a woman who appeared, on the surface of things, to be providing her own evidence. "What do you propose?" she asked. "I have been thinking about Pemberton's winter ball," Caspian said. "It is in 11 days. Half of London will be there, including most of the cathedral congregation. If you appear, with me, publicly, presented as a guest of this house in full standing, it changes the visual narrative before it calcifies." She looked at him carefully. "You would escort a publicly disgraced woman to one of the season's most prominent social events." "I would escort Alara Voss," he said, with a precision that was clearly intentional, "to a ball. The publicly disgraced portion of that description is Edmund's language, not mine, and I have no intention of adopting it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the breakfast room windows, the December morning was pale and still, the garden snow cover thinning now in patches where the winter sun reached longest. "They will talk regardless," she said. "Appearing together does not silence the gossip. It may amplify it. It changes its direction," Caspian said. There is a significant difference between London asking why the Duke of Ashmore is hiding a disgraced woman in his private residence, and London asking why the Duke of Ashmore is publicly standing beside a woman whose disgrace he evidently does not credit. He paused. One version makes you a secret. The other makes you a question. And questions, she said slowly, invite scrutiny of the premise. Exactly. She thought about the ball. She thought about walking into a room full of people who had either been present in the cathedral or had heard an account of it, and she thought about what it would cost, the particular expenditure of courage required to stand straight under that quality of collective gaze. She had done it once already, in the cathedral itself, and she had survived it. But she had been in shock then, moving on instinct. Walking into Pemberton's ball would require doing it deliberately, with full knowledge and full choice. She thought about Edmund, somewhere in London, feeding the machine. All right, she said. The ball. Caspian nodded, and she could see him already moving forward in his thinking, already 3 steps into the planning of it. But before he could speak again, Aldous appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man carrying news he would have preferred not to carry. Your Grace, Aldous said, I apologize for the interruption. There is a letter from Lord Harwick's solicitor. It was delivered this morning by hand. Caspian took it. He read it. His expression did not change, which Alara had come to understand meant that it had changed entirely in ways he was choosing not to display. He handed it to her, without comment. She read it. The language was legal and precise, and clearly drafted by someone who knew exactly what each word was doing. The substance of it, stripped of its formal casing, was this: Lord Harwick, in consultation with Lord Edmund Voss, as trustee of the Voss estate, was initiating proceedings before the Lord Chancellor's office to have Alara formally declared a person of compromised moral character under the terms of the Voss Trust. The proceedings would be supported by sworn testimony from Lord Harwick, from 2 additional witnesses whose names she did not recognize, and from Edmund himself. They expected a preliminary determination within 6 weeks. 6 weeks. 8 days before her 25th birthday. She set the letter down with the same precise care she had used on the trust document, on the breakfast cup, on every object she had touched since arriving here. The particular deliberateness of a woman who has decided that she will not break things, will not be broken, will meet every blow with the steady resistance of something that has decided to remain standing. They are accelerating, she said. Yes. The ball is in 11 days. The legal proceedings begin. Before that. Yes. Caspian's voice was level. They are moving faster than I anticipated, which means they are more frightened than I anticipated, which means the evidence you are assembling is closer to the surface than they would like. She looked at him. They know you are looking. Someone has told them, or they have made a reasonable inference. His jaw set slightly. It changes the timeline. We need to move on the trust document before the preliminary hearing. I have a meeting with my solicitor this afternoon. I'm going to push for access to the original probate records within the week. She nodded. Her mind was moving quickly now, turning the problem, looking for its edges. The witnesses, she said. The 2 names in the letter. I don't recognize them. Nor do I. Not yet. He met her eyes. I will by tomorrow. She believed him. This, she realized, was one of the specific qualities of Caspian Devereux that was most dangerous to her carefully maintained composure. Not his kindness, not his steadiness, but his absolute and unperformative competence. He did not promise what he could not deliver. He did not comfort her with optimism that wasn't earned. And so when he said something with that particular quiet certainty, she found herself believing it completely. And the belief opened something in her chest that was both relief and something more complicated. 2 days later, the second pressure arrived. It came in the form of a visit, unannounced, which was itself a statement, from Lord Carver, a senior member of the same political circle in which Caspian operated, a man of significant influence and the specific kind of friendship that comes wrapped in expectation. He was shown to the drawing room, where Caspian received him alone. Alara was in the library. She was not, technically, listening, But Ashmore Hall had been built in an era before architects prioritized acoustic privacy, and the drawing room shared a wall with the library. And she was sitting very still. Carver's message was delivered with the diplomatic brutality of a man who considers himself a friend. The situation, he said, was becoming untenable. The association with Miss Voss, whatever its private character, was creating a political liability that Caspian's allies were finding difficult to absorb. There were votes in the spring session that required coalition. There were relationships that were currently strained. If Caspian would simply, quietly, create some distance, find the woman suitable lodgings elsewhere, allow the matter to resolve through its natural channels. The silence that followed was long enough that Alara held her breath. "No," Caspian said. One word, spoken with the same tone he might have used to decline a second cup of tea. Not cold, not dramatic, simply final in the way that things are final when a person has already done their thinking and has nothing left to deliberate. Carver left 20 minutes later. Alara heard the front door close. She was still sitting in the library when Caspian appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression communicated that he was aware she had heard, and that he had no intention of pretending otherwise. "The library wall," she said, "is not as substantial as it appears." "I know," he said. "I grew up in this house." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said simply, "I did." And he went back to his study, and she sat in the library with a book she was not reading, and outside the winter afternoon pressed its cold gray face against the windows, and London went on sharpening its knives, and inside Ashmore Hall something quietly, stubbornly refused to bleed. The night of Pemberton's winter ball arrived with the particular cold clarity of a December sky that has spent all day deciding whether to snow and chosen instead to simply freeze. The air sharp and still, the stars very bright, the streets of Mayfair gleaming with a thin glaze of ice that caught the lamplight and threw it back in fragments. Alara stood before the mirror in the East Wing dressing room and looked at herself with the focused attention of a general surveying terrain before a campaign. Mrs. Crane had, with characteristic efficiency and no unnecessary comment, arranged everything. The gown was deep green silk, not Alara's own, but borrowed from a dressmaker Caspian's secretary had engaged with notable discretion, with a modest neckline and long sleeves and a quality of construction that communicated, without announcement, that the woman wearing it had not been diminished. Her hair was dressed simply and well. At her throat was a single strand of pearls, her own, retrieved from the Wiltshire estate inventory by Caspian's solicitor 2 days prior, the first piece of her own property she had held in her hands since the cathedral. She had put them on herself with great deliberateness, and she had thought about the other pearls, the ones scattered across the marble floor, and she had decided that those pearls were Gerald Harwick's problem, not hers. She was ready. Caspian was waiting at the foot of the stairs. He was dressed with the same dark precision she had come to associate with him. No ornamentation, no performance. Simply a man who understood that confidence needed no decoration. He looked up when she appeared at the top of the stairs, and the expression that crossed his face was unguarded in the way that expressions are when they arrive before the person knows they are being observed, something frank and undefended, something that he replaced quickly with his customary composure, but not quite quickly enough. She descended. He offered his arm. She took it. "How are you?" he asked quietly, as they moved toward the entrance. "Entirely terrified," she said pleasantly, "and completely determined. A fairly reliable combination, in my experience." Something warmed in his eyes. In mine as well. The Pemberton house was 3 streets away, close enough to walk in better weather. Close enough tonight to make the carriage ride feel like a brief compression of time between the private world of Ashmore Hall and the very public one they were about to enter. Through the carriage window Alara watched the lit facades of Mayfair pass, and she breathed carefully, and she thought about what it meant to walk into a room full of people who believed they already knew your story. It meant showing them a different page. The entrance hall of Pemberton's house was already full when they arrived. That particular density of well-dressed people that signals an event at the height of its social ambition, the noise level carefully calibrated between elegant murmur and genuine festivity. Lord Pemberton himself stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals with the practiced warmth of an excellent host, and when he saw Caspian, and then saw Alara on Caspian's arm, something moved through his expression that was quickly mastered, but not before she read it clearly. He was surprised. And beneath the surprise, something that looked very much like respect. "Ashimore," Pemberton said, clasping Caspian's hand. Then, turning to her with deliberate warmth, "Miss Voss, I am very glad you are here." She met his eyes. "Thank you for having me, Lord Pemberton." 3 words. A social exchange of complete ordinariness. And yet she felt the specific weight of them, the public declaration embedded in the ordinary courtesy, the statement made simply by standing here and being addressed by name and responding as a woman of full standing response. They entered the ballroom. The effect was not immediate. It accumulated, a ripple moving outward from the point of their entry, a gradual alteration in the room's ambient awareness as people registered, one by one, what they were seeing. She felt it in the quality of the glances, the way eyes moved toward her, and then toward Caspian, and then back, performing rapid social calculations. She felt it in the slight pauses in nearby conversations, the microscopic adjustments in body language that communicated, across the ballroom, that something of significance had arrived. She kept her chin level. She kept her hand steady on Caspian's arm. She smiled when smiled at, and inclined her head when heads were inclined toward her, and conducted herself throughout with the composed pleasantness of a woman who has absolutely nothing to answer for. Caspian, beside her, was a masterclass in the kind of authority that does not announce itself. He did not glare at anyone who stared too long. He did not make speeches or issue challenges. He simply moved through the room with Alara, as though this were the most natural arrangement in the world, introducing her where introductions were appropriate, positioning himself always slightly between her and the angles from which she was most observed, a presence that communicated without words. This woman is here. She is welcome. Adjust your understanding accordingly. It was working. She could feel it working. The room's initial electricity of scandal gradually modulating into something more complex, more uncertain. The comfortable simplicity of the established narrative complicated by the evidence of what they were actually seeing. And then, from across the ballroom, she saw Gerald Harwick. He was standing near the far windows with 2 men she didn't recognize and a woman she did, Lady Ashworth, whose dinner party had launched the first wave of gossip. He had seen her. She could tell from the stillness that moved through his posture, the way his conversation stopped mid-gesture. She looked at him directly. She did not look away. She held his gaze across the width of Pemberton's ballroom with the steady, clear-eyed attention of a woman who has decided that she has finished being made to feel small, and she watched him look away first. It was a small victory. She allowed herself to feel it anyway. "He's here," she said quietly to Caspian. "I know." A pause. "Don't look at him again. He wants a reaction. He came tonight specifically to provoke one." "He'll be disappointed," she said. "I know that too." The evening continued. She danced twice, once with Pemberton himself, who made it a point to lead her onto the floor with the particular visibility of a host making a statement, and once with a young lord whose name she didn't quite catch, but whose cheerful obliviousness to the evening's social undercurrents was, she found, deeply refreshing. She took supper with Caspian at a small table near the windows, and they talked in the low, comfortable way they had discovered over the past fortnight, not the careful social conversation of people performing connection, but the real kind, the kind that doesn't require effort. She was almost, not relaxed exactly, but something adjacent to it, when all disappeared. He should not have been at the ball. He was Caspian's secretary, not a social figure, and his presence here at this hour communicated emergency in the precise, controlled way that Aldous communicated everything. He appeared at Caspian's shoulder, bent briefly toward his ear, and pressed a folded paper into his hand. She watched Caspian read it. She watched his face. She had learned his face over the past 2 weeks in the way you learn a landscape you're going to have to navigate, not just its surface features, but its specific language, the way certain terrain shifts communicate what the weather is doing before the weather arrives. What she saw now was contained but serious. The focused inward attention of a man receiving information that changes the tactical picture. "What is it?" she asked, when Aldous had withdrawn. He handed her the paper. It was brief and devastating. Edmund's solicitor had filed an emergency motion with the Lord Chancellor's office that afternoon, hours before the ball, timed, she understood immediately, to coincide with whatever they anticipated Caspian would do tonight. The motion requested an accelerated determination of Alara's character and the immediate appointment of Edmund as her permanent legal guardian, pending the outcome. It was supported by a sworn affidavit from a woman named Mary Grant, who claimed to have been Alara's personal maid and who alleged, in specific and entirely fabricated detail, a history of conduct that justified the original accusation. There was a second page. It outlined the legal consequence of the guardian appointment if granted, that Alara would be unable to enter into any contracts, receive any property, or make any legal decisions independently. That all communications with her would legally pass through Edmund. That the March deadline, the 25th birthday, the automatic expiry of the trust, none of it would matter, because a guardian appointment superseded trust terms. They had found a way around March. She set the paper down on the supper table between the wine glasses and the half-eaten plates, in the middle of Pemberton's winter ball with its music and its candlelight and its 200 well-dressed people. And she felt the specific quality of fury that arrives not hot, but cold. Not the fury that wants to shout, but the fury that wants to dismantle, piece by piece, every mechanism of the machine that produced this moment. "Mary Grant," she said. "I have never had a maid by that name." "I know," Caspian said. "This is their response to tonight." She looked at him. "We came here and changed the narrative, and they filed this within hours. They were watching. They were prepared. They had this ready and were waiting for the right provocation." His voice was even and deliberate. "Which means they are frightened enough to accelerate again. Which means you were right. We are closer than they wanted us to be." She looked at the paper one more time. Then she looked up at the ballroom full of people, at the candlelight and the music, and Gerald Harwick, somewhere across the room, who had come here tonight to watch her fail. "What do we do?" "We finish the evening," he said, with a steadiness that she felt in her own chest like a counterweight. "We do not leave early. We do not give them the satisfaction of watching us run." A pause. "And first thing tomorrow morning we go to my solicitor, and we file everything we have. Is it enough?" He met her eyes. Something in his expression was not quite certainty, but was a thing that precedes certainty, the absolute commitment to achieving it. "It will be," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her wine glass, and she turned back toward the room, and she kept her chin level and her spine straight, and she did not leave early. Later, she would think that this was the night things became irreversible, not because of the legal filing, not because of Gerald's retreat across the ballroom, but because of a supper table and a folded piece of paper, and a man who said "we" so naturally that she hadn't noticed it until after, had not noticed until she was in the carriage going home, that he had not said "I will file everything I have." He had said "we." She noticed it in the carriage, with the frost-bright streets of Mayfair passing the windows, and she held it quietly, and she did not say anything about it. But she noticed. She found the ledger by accident. It was the 14th day of her residence at Ashenmore Hall, a Tuesday, cold and overcast with the particular flat gray light of a December afternoon that has decided to offer nothing. She had been in the study, Caspian's study, where she now worked regularly alongside him, the two of them developing the comfortable parallel industry of people who have discovered that they think better in each other's proximity, looking for a specific reference document that Aldous had mentioned leaving on the lower shelf. She found the reference document, and beside it, partially concealed beneath a larger folio, she found a leather-bound ledger with Caspian's handwriting on the cover tab. She would not have opened it, except that a loose page had slipped out and fallen to the floor, and she picked it up to replace it, and the nature of its contents was immediately visible before she had formed any intention of reading it. It was an accounting page. Figures, dates, descriptions. She recognized the format. She had grown up watching her father manage estate accounts, had learned early what financial records looked like and how to read them. What she saw on this page stopped her completely. The figures were large. The dates were recent, spanning the past 3 weeks, beginning the day after the cathedral. And the descriptions told a story she had not been told. She sat down slowly in the nearest chair, the page in her hand, and she read it again with great care. The first entry was a called debt, a significant sum owed by a business associate whom Caspian had apparently been carrying for some time, called in abruptly and in full. The description noted simply, expedited, necessary. The second entry was a political favor, translated here into its financial equivalent, a sum paid to smooth a complication in a parliamentary vote, a complication Alara understood with cold clarity had been manufactured specifically to pressure Caspian over her presence in his house. The third entry was legal fees, already substantial and annotated with a projected total that was more than substantial. There were others. 8 entries in total, spanning 14 days. Each one traceable, she understood, to her, to the cost of standing beside her. She opened the ledger properly then. She needed to understand the complete picture, and she was no longer capable of the restraint required not to look. The ledger was organized by category. Legal costs were the largest and growing. There were 2 entries that she identified as the result of political relationships strained past their tolerance. Associates who had withdrawn support from a pending bill that Caspian cared about, their withdrawal clearly connected to his public association with her. There was a social entry, almost small enough to miss, a club membership, apparently, that had been quietly suggested he resign. The total, projected forward to the estimated conclusion of the legal proceedings, was an amount that did not threaten Caspian's solvency. He was wealthy enough that it did not approach that territory. But it was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. She closed the ledger. She set it back on the shelf with the precise care of someone returning something they should not have touched. She replaced the loose page. She straightened the folio that had partially concealed it. Then she sat back down in the chair because her legs were not entirely reliable, and she pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked at the middle distance and thought. She thought about the club membership. She thought about the parliamentary bill and the relationships strained beyond tolerance, and the legal fees accumulating daily like snow. She thought about Lord Carver's visit, create some distance, find the woman suitable lodgings, and the single unequivocal no that had traveled through the library wall. She thought about what it cost to say no to the things that cost you. She thought about how she had arrived here 2 weeks ago with nothing, no coat, no money, no name that wasn't already in the process of being legally dismantled, and how Caspian had simply opened his house and his resources and his considerable personal and political capital and begun spending all of it quietly, without announcement, without any indication that a ledger existed at all. She had asked him why, that morning in the sitting room over the trust documents. "Because what was done to you is wrong," he had said, "and because I am in a position to do something about it." She understood now that he was spending himself into a position where that would be less true than it had been when he said it. She sat in the study for a long time. The flat gray light shifted toward early dark. The fire burned low. She thought about March, 8 weeks away now, the birthday that was supposed to solve everything, the deadline that Edmund had worked so hard to circumvent. She thought about the guardian application and the fabricated maid, and the 6 weeks the solicitor had estimated for a preliminary determination, and how those 6 weeks and 8 weeks arranged themselves on a mental calendar, with an overlap that was either sufficient or insufficient, depending on factors none of them could fully control. She thought about what happened to Caspian if the legal proceedings failed, if Edmund succeeded, if she became, in the eyes of the law, a ward of her uncle's permanent authority, unable to contract, to testify, to act independently. In that circumstance, everything Caspian had spent, financial, political, social, would be simply gone, spent on a loss. She thought, I cannot let that happen. And beneath that thought, quieter and more painful, I cannot be the thing that diminishes him. I cannot be, again, the mechanism by which a man with power rearranges the life of someone who trusted him. She knew this comparison was not fair. She knew that Caspian was nothing like Edmund or Gerald, that his expenditure was chosen and voluntary, and made from an entirely different place than anything Edmund had ever calculated. She knew that the situations were not equivalent. She knew all of this, and the fear held its ground anyway, because fear rarely yields to reason alone. When Caspian returned to the study at 4:30, she was still in the chair. He read the room immediately. She could see him doing it, that rapid, quiet assessment that missed nothing. And his gaze moved to the shelf and back to her, and she watched him understand. "You found the ledger," he said. "A page had fallen out," she said. I didn't intend to read it." "But you did." "Yes." He came into the room fully, closed the door, and sat in the chair across from her. The same arrangement they had fallen into naturally over the past fortnight, the two of them on opposite sides of the working table, close enough for easy conversation, far enough for the kind of privacy that people sometimes need even from people they trust. He did not seem angry. He seemed, if anything, resigned, the expression of a man who had known this moment was coming, and had simply not known its exact timing. "It's too much," she said. "Caspian, what I've seen in that ledger is too much." "That's not your determination to make," he said, with a gentleness that made it no less firm. "It is absolutely my determination to make. It is being spent on me, because of me, without my knowledge or consent." She heard the edge in her own voice and recognized it. It was not anger at him. It was a specific anguish of someone who has spent years being arranged and managed, and who has found, in a ledger on a library shelf, evidence that the pattern is repeating in a form she hadn't recognized because it was being done with kindness rather than calculation. "Ilara, I understand that your intentions are entirely different from Edmund's," she said, before he could continue, because she needed him to know she knew this, needed it said clearly. "I understand that. I am not comparing you to him." A breath. "But I have spent 4 years being managed by someone who made decisions about my life that I was not permitted to see or participate in. And I find that I will not, be in that position again, regardless of the quality of the person making the decisions." The silence was different from their usual silences. It had an edge. "What are you saying?" he asked. His voice was careful. "I think I should find other lodgings," she said. The words cost her more than she expected. She had not understood, until she heard herself say them, how thoroughly Ashmore Hall had become, in 2 weeks, something that felt like safety. Something modest, properly chaperoned. "Where my presence doesn't represent a daily financial and political cost to you, and where Edmund cannot use my residence here as material for the guardian application." "Ilara." He said her name with a weight that stopped her. "The guardian application is not strengthened by your presence here. Edmund's case rests on fabricated testimony, not on your address. Moving you to lodgings does not change the legal proceedings. It only removes you from the place where I can most efficiently protect you. It removes the cost. I don't care about the cost." Not loudly, simply and completely. "I have never once, in this entire situation, thought about the cost as a reason to reconsider. Not once." She looked at him. He looked back. In the low firelight and the December dark gathering at the windows, he looked exactly like what he was. A man who was telling the complete truth and needed her to believe it. "Then you should have shown me the ledger," she said quietly. "From the beginning. I would not have let you carry it alone." Something shifted in his expression. It moved through him like weather, unexpected and revealing, the particular kind of surprise that comes from an angle you weren't defending. "You're right," he said, plainly and without qualification. "You're right. I should have." She closed her eyes briefly. The resolution she had been building, the careful architecture of the decision to leave, was doing something inconvenient. It was softening at the edges, losing its structural integrity under the weight of his honesty. "I need to know," she said, opening her eyes, "that I am a participant, not a subject." "Yes," he said. "I understand. And I am sorry that I made you feel otherwise." A pause. "Please don't leave." The fire breathed beside them. Outside the study windows, Mayfair was dark and cold and full of people constructing their comfortable certainties about who Ilara Voss was and what she deserved. She looked at the man across the table who had called in debts and absorbed political damage, and refused the Duke's request, and spent 14 days building a case to restore everything that had been taken from her, and who had just said, "I'm sorry," without a single qualification. "Show me everything," she said. "Every cost, every figure, every decision going forward. I see it before it's made." Agreed. He held her gaze. Agreed. Then I'll stay, she said. The relief that moved through his expression was not small. He controlled it quickly, but not completely, and she filed it away beside the drawing in the star chart book and the unguarded warmth on his face at her first real laugh, all the small moments of him that were accumulating in her, quiet and persistent and entirely beyond her management. She stayed. And the work went on. She left on a Thursday. Not because she had stopped trusting him. Not because the fear had returned or the argument in the study had left damage she couldn't repair. She left because of a letter, not from Edmund, not from Gerald's solicitor, but from a woman named Clara Hewitt, who had been her closest friend during her first season and who had, in the intervening years, married well and moved to the periphery of the same society that had watched Alara's destruction without moving. The letter was kind. Clara was genuinely kind, which made what it contained more difficult to dismiss. She wrote that she had heard things, not the gossip or not only the gossip, but specific information, passed through a reliable chain, that Edmund was preparing to call additional witnesses for the guardian hearing. One of them was a physician. The allegation being constructed was not merely of moral compromise, but of mental instability, the kind of determination that, once entered into the legal record, was extraordinarily difficult to reverse regardless of subsequent evidence. And at the bottom of the letter, in a postscript written in a slightly different ink, as though added after some deliberation, *, my love, I am told the Duke of Ashmore stands to lose his seat on the Trade Commission if this continues much longer. Carver has apparently made it official. I tell you this only because I believe you would want to know, and because I suspect no one else has told you, *. Alara read the postscript 3 times. The Trade Commission. She knew what it meant, had spent enough time in the study with Caspian's papers to understand the shape of his political life. The commission was not decorative. It represented 8 years of accumulated influence, a platform from which he had managed to translate the theoretical authority of his title into actual legislative consequence. It was, in the architecture of everything he had built, a load-bearing wall, and Carver was removing it. Because of her. She did not tell Caspian about the letter. This was, she understood even as she did it, precisely the kind of withholding she had asked him never to practice on her, and the hypocrisy of it sat in her chest like a stone. But the stone was outweighed by what she had read in Clara's postscript, by the cold arithmetic of what staying now cost against what leaving might preserve. She wrote 3 notes. One to Mrs. Crane, thanking her with the specific and genuine warmth of someone who understands that gratitude to good people should always be expressed completely. One to Aldous, asking him to arrange a modest hackney carriage for 6 in the morning, and trusting, correctly she thought, that Aldous' fundamental decency would lead him to comply before informing his employer. And one to Caspian, which she wrote 4 times before she had a version she could leave. She did not tell him she was protecting him. He would refuse that framing, and he would not be entirely wrong to do so. She told him instead the truth as she understood it, that she was not running from him, that she was not afraid, that everything they had built in terms of the legal case must continue, and she expected to be part of it. That she had found rooms with a Mrs. Alderton on a respectable street in Bloomsbury, properly chaperoned, appropriate in every social particular. That she needed, and this was the truest sentence in the letter, to face the remainder of this fight from a position that was her own, not borrowed. That she needed to know she could stand in the courtroom and the drawing room, and wherever else this ended without the question of what it had cost him obscuring the question of what had been done to her. She sealed the letter. She placed it on the pillow of the East Wing suite's bed, where he would find it when Mrs. Crane reported her absence. She left at 6 in the morning with a small bundle of things that were genuinely hers. A few items of borrowed clothing she intended to return, her father's letters, which Caspian's solicitor had retrieved, and the strand of pearls. And she climbed into the hackney, and she did not look back at the house, because she knew that if she looked back, she would not be able to maintain the decision, and the decision had to be maintained. She was 3 streets away when the second carriage appeared. It was black, with no insignia on the door. She recognized it before she recognized what it meant, and then she recognized both simultaneously, and the feeling that moved through her was so complicated that she could not have named it except to say that it was not simple, and it was not comfortable, and it was not, despite everything, unwelcome. The carriage pulled alongside the hackney and stopped. The door opened. Caspian stepped out into the cold Thursday morning in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no hat, the clear evidence of a man who had read a note on a pillow and come immediately, without stopping to dress properly. And he stood in the street and looked at her through the hackney window with an expression that had nothing of his usual containment. She opened the hackney door. She stepped out. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and clarifying. They stood on the empty morning street 3 feet apart, their breath visible in the frozen air, and looked at each other. "Aldous told you," she said. "Aldous told me," he confirmed. "I asked him not to." He exercised his judgment. A pause, and something moved across his face that was not quite humor and not quite anguish, but held elements of both. "I pay him to exercise it well." She looked at him. The January morning pressed its cold around them, and the city was barely awake, and there was no one on this street to perform for, no social calculus to navigate, nothing between them except the 15 feet of frozen pavement and 10 years of accumulated silence, and the truth. "Clara's letter," she said. "The Trade Commission." Carver made it official. He absorbed this without visible surprise, which told her he had already known, or had suspected, and had made his calculation and arrived at his answer before she had made hers. "Yes," he said. "You didn't tell me." Something in his expression acknowledged the symmetry of that. "No," he said. "I didn't. Because you knew I would do exactly this." "Because I knew you would do exactly this," he agreed, "and I was trying to prevent it." She breathed. The cold air filled her lungs and steadied her. "Caspian, the commission is a position," he said. "A significant one. One I valued and will be sorry to lose." He took a step toward her, not large, not closing the distance, but reducing it, enough to change the quality of what the space between them held. "It is not, however, the thing I am least willing to lose." She looked at him. He looked back, and there was nothing contained about his expression now, nothing managed or calibrated or held at the careful distance that he had maintained with such precision for 6 weeks. He looked like a man who has been careful for a very long time and has decided that this particular moment does not deserve caution. "I have been waiting," he said, "since I was 20 years old and made a terrible decision at the gates of a Wiltshire estate, to say something that I should have said then. I have been waiting, and I have been building, and I have been telling myself that I needed to be worthy first, needed to have something sufficient to offer first, and I have wasted 10 years on that particular form of cowardice." He stopped, breathed. "I am not going to waste any more of it." The street was very quiet. Somewhere nearby, a cart horse stamped against the cold. "Ilara," he said, "I love you. I have loved you since I was 18 years old, watching a 13-year-old girl explain to me, with complete authority, that I had the Orion constellation slightly wrong, and that I ought to look more carefully before making confident claims about things I only partially understood. I have loved you through 10 years of distance and silence, and all of my own failures of courage. I love you now here in this street in January, in your borrowed coat with your father's letters under your arm." A breath. "And I am asking you, not managing you, not arranging you, not making decisions on your behalf. I am asking you to come back. Not because I can protect you better from the house. Because I want the chance, when this is finished, to ask you something further." She stood in the January morning and looked at the man who had sent a carriage before he knew she'd get in, who had said not one condition, who had drawn a girl in summer grass in the margins of a star chart and carried the book for 20 years. She thought about cowardice, about her own, the letter on the pillow, the 6 in the morning departure, the self-sacrificing logic that was also, if she was being completely honest, the logic of someone who is afraid of wanting something this much and has found a virtuous-seeming reason to retreat from it. "You had the Orion constellation wrong," she said. Something broke open in his expression. "I know," he said. "You were right." "I usually am," she said. "You should factor that into future planning." He took another step toward her. The distance between them was now the kind that required decision to maintain. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is not a no," she said, which was honest. And then, because she was done retreating from things she wanted, "Ask me the further question now." He was close enough now that she could see the cold had reddened his face, and that he didn't care at all. "Will you let me court you," he said, "properly? When this is finished? When your name is restored and your inheritance is yours, and there is nothing complicated or desperate about the circumstances? Will you let me simply ask, in the ordinary way, if you will consider me?" She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very careful question." "I am a very careful man." "You are standing in the street in January without a coat," she said. "I contain multitudes," he said. She laughed. It came out warm and real and unguarded, and she watched it move through him like the first real warmth of spring. "Yes," she said. "Ask me the further question. When this is finished." She paused. "Now go and put a coat on." He smiled, fully, without reservation. The smile she had been catching in fragments for 6 weeks finally assembled into its complete form. And it was, she thought, the most devastating thing about him, which was saying something considerable given the competition. He did not touch her. He simply offered his arm, there in the January street, with the same deliberate formality as the night of the ball, and she took it, and they walked back to the black carriage together, and he handed her in, and this time she did not look back because she didn't need to. She was not leaving anything behind. Meanwhile, in the offices of a senior clerk to the Lord Chancellor, a man named Whitfield, who had served that office for 19 years and who had, for the past 3 of them, been receiving small but consistent payments from Edmund Voss for small but consistent services, a sealed packet arrived by private courier. The packet contained a letter from Caspian's solicitor and a collection of supporting documents. It contained the original probate records for the Voss estate, annotated by a handwriting expert who had compared the trust clause with other documents from the same period and found the clause inconsistent in both ink and paper quality. It contained a sworn affidavit from the solicitor who had originally handled the probate, a man now elderly and apparently troubled enough by recent events to overcome his previous silence. It contained records of 2 payments from the Voss estate accounts to Gerald Harwick, with dates that aligned precisely with the wedding announcement and the dissolution. And it contained, on the final page, a separate letter, addressed not to the clerk but to the Lord Chancellor himself, that outlined, in Caspian's precise and measured prose, the specific nature of Whitfield's relationship with Edmund Voss and the specific services for which he had been compensated. Whitfield read this letter. He read it twice. He set it down on his desk with the expression of a man watching a floor give way beneath him. By noon that day, the Lord Chancellor's office had received 3 separate requests for urgent meetings regarding the Voss estate proceedings. Edmund Voss, across the city, did not yet know that the floor was moving. But it was moving. The hearing was set for the 22nd of January. Alara knew the date the way she knew her own heartbeat, constantly, involuntarily, with an awareness that was present in everything she did in the days preceding it. She woke with it. She worked with it. She sat in Mrs. Alderton's respectable Bloomsbury parlor in the evenings, her father's letters spread before her, and she felt the date moving toward her with the patient inevitability of a tide. She was not afraid, or rather, she was afraid in the precise, managed way that she had learned to be afraid of things she could not avoid, which was to feel the fear completely and then set it aside and do the work anyway. She had been practicing this her whole life without knowing it had a name. Caspian came every morning. He came to the Bloomsbury rooms with Aldous and with papers and with the focused, systematic energy of a man who is running out of time and responding to that fact not with panic, but with acceleration. They worked at Mrs. Alderton's dining table, while Mrs. Alderton herself moved approvingly through the background, providing tea at intervals with the satisfied air of a woman who had expected something respectable and received something that exceeded her expectations. The case had developed, in the 10 days since the packet reached the Lord Chancellor's office, with a speed that told Alara something important about how thoroughly Edmund's network had been dependent on the cooperation of people who, when presented with clear evidence of the alternative, preferred self-preservation to loyalty. The solicitor who had handled the original probate of Mr. Fenwick, 73 years old, residing now in Bath, had provided a full written account. He had not added the clause himself. He had, however, been present when Edmund produced the document in a subsequent meeting and had been persuaded, through a combination of financial inducement and veiled threat, to allow it to pass without objection. He had been troubled by this for 4 years. The arrival of Caspian's solicitor had been, in Mr. Fenwick's own words, something of a relief. The 2 witnesses whose names had appeared in Gerald's legal filing, the men Alara had not recognized, had been located. One of them, under the quiet pressure of a conversation with Caspian's solicitor that outlined exactly what his perjury would cost him, had recanted his affidavit entirely. The second had proven more stubborn until Aldous had discovered, through the particular information network that efficient secretaries maintain, that the man's business interests overlapped in compromising ways with Edmund's own accounts. He had recanted by the following Tuesday. Mary Grant, the fabricated maid, had proven the simplest matter of all. She did not exist, or rather, the name existed, attached to a real woman who had never been employed in any household remotely connected to the Voss family, and who, when contacted, had expressed considerable alarm at discovering her name in a legal document, and had provided a sworn statement to that effect with remarkable promptness. Gerald Harwick, faced with the accumulating collapse of the structure he had built, had done the thing that men of Gerald's particular character tend to do when the edifice fails. He had attempted to negotiate. He had sent a letter to Caspian's solicitor suggesting that he might be willing to provide testimony regarding Edmund's role in the original arrangement, in exchange for certain considerations regarding his own exposure. Caspian had read this letter and sent back a single-line response. There will be no negotiations. Provide the testimony or do not. The outcome of the hearing does not depend on your cooperation. This was, Alara understood when she read the exchange, both a legal statement and a personal one. It was a statement of a man who had built his case on foundations solid enough that he did not need to purchase the roof from the person who had helped burn the house down. Gerald provided the testimony anyway. He had apparently concluded correctly that cooperation without negotiation was better than the alternative. On the morning of the 22nd, Alara rose at 6. She dressed herself with the same deliberateness she had brought to every morning since the cathedral. Each action performed fully, completely, with the attention of someone who understands that the accumulation of small dignities is itself a form of resistance. She put on the green silk dress, her own now, purchased with the first small advance from the estate accounts that Caspian's solicitor had managed to unlock pending the hearing's outcome. She put on the pearl necklace. She looked at herself in the mirror with the same clear, unsentimental gaze she had turned on her reflection the night of Pemberton's ball. She was ready. Caspian arrived at 7:30. He did not comment on the dress or the pearls, but something in his expression when he saw her communicated that he had noticed both, and that what they represented had not escaped him. "How are you?" he asked. Their morning question, the one he had asked every day since the study, since the promise to show her everything, since the January street. "Ready," she said, which was both more and less than the truth, and which he received with a nod that acknowledged its complexity. They went together. The Lord Chancellor's hearing room was smaller than she had expected. She had constructed it in her imagination as something cathedral-like. High ceilings, stone, the particular weight of institutional architecture designed to communicate the power of the state over the individual. What she found was a wood-paneled room of moderate size with tall windows and a central table, and the specific smell of old documents and deliberated decisions. It was full of people, solicitors and their clerks, Edmund's representation on one side and Caspian's on the other, a court recorder, and at the head of the table a senior examiner named Bartholomew Holt, whose expression suggested he had already read the submitted materials and had formed significant preliminary opinions. Edmund was there. She had not seen him since the cathedral. He looked, she thought, exactly as he always had, composed, proprietary, the face of a man who has arranged things in his favor and is simply waiting for the arrangement to be confirmed. When she entered the room, he looked at her with the particular assessment of someone checking whether an object has been damaged during transport, and she met his gaze with complete steadiness, and she watched something shift in his expression, a fractional recalibration, the look of a man who has expected to find something broken and has found something else entirely. She sat. She folded her hands on the table. She breathed. The proceedings opened with the formal submission of materials, both sides presenting their documented cases to the examiner in the prescribed order. Edmund's solicitor spoke first, laying out the original framework: the trust clause, the public disgrace at the cathedral, the affidavit and witness testimony supporting the guardian application. His presentation was practiced and confident, the confidence of a team that had prepared extensively and had not yet received the full intelligence of what had changed beneath them. Then Caspian's solicitor began. He was a quiet man named Reeves, small and precise, who spoke with the unhurried clarity of someone who knows that his material requires no embellishment. He presented the handwriting analysis first, the expert's determination that the trust clause was inconsistent with surrounding documents, written later and on paper of a different manufacture than the remainder of the trust instrument. Edmund's solicitor objected. The examiner overruled him. Reeves presented Mr. Fenwick's affidavit next. He read the key portions aloud, in his quiet, precise voice, and the room was very still, and Alara watched Edmund's composure undergo its first visible stress fracture, a slight tightening around the eyes, a shift in the set of his jaw. The recanted witness affidavits came third. Both of them, submitted simultaneously, each accompanied by a sworn statement of the circumstances under which the original affidavit had been obtained. Edmund's solicitor made several objections. The examiner sustained none of them. The Mary Grant statement. The financial records showing the 2 payments to Gerald Harwick. Gerald's own testimony, submitted in writing, signed and witnessed, outlining the specific arrangement he had entered into with Edmund regarding the wedding and its dissolution. By the time Reeves had finished, the room had the specific quality of silence that follows the completion of something irrevocable. Examiner Holt looked at Edmund's solicitor. "Do you wish to respond to the documentary evidence?" Edmund's solicitor spoke for 11 minutes. He was objectively very good, the performance of a skilled professional doing everything possible with insufficient material. He challenged the handwriting analysis, the credibility of the recanting witnesses, the self-interest inherent in Gerald Harwick's testimony. He was thorough, and he was competent, and he was, in the end, attempting to hold back a tide with both hands. The examiner listened without expression. When Edmund's solicitor finished, Holt made several notes. He reviewed 3 of the submitted documents directly, with the focused attention of someone checking details against his own prior reading. Then he set down his pen. "The guardian application," he said, "is denied." Edmund's solicitor began to speak. The examiner raised one hand. Furthermore, Holt continued, "In light of the documentary evidence presented today regarding the modification of the Voss trust instrument and the financial arrangements between Lord Edmund Voss and Lord Gerald Harwick, I am referring both matters to the appropriate legal authorities for further examination. The trust clause in question is void as fraudulently introduced. The Voss estate reverts to its original terms." He paused. "Miss Voss, as of today, and pending your 25th birthday in March, at which point the trust expires by its own legitimate terms, you are the rightful beneficiary of your father's estate. Edmund Voss is removed as trustee with immediate effect." The room was very quiet. Alara sat with her hands folded on the table and felt the words settle into her, not all at once, but in sequence, each one arriving with its own weight. Guardian application denied. Trust clause void. Rightful beneficiary. Removed as trustee. She had known this outcome was likely. Reeves had been careful to temper expectation, but the evidence was what it was, and Caspian had told her 2 days ago that he believed the case was sound. She had known, and still, the knowing and the happening were different countries, separated by the particular distance between anticipating relief and actually breathing it. She looked at Edmund. He was looking at the table. The composure was intact, barely, and with visible effort, but intact. He was a man of iron self-control, and he would not break here, in this room, and she did not particularly require him to. What she required, what she had, now in legal fact, was freedom from him. The breaking could be a private matter. The freedom was what she needed to be public. Outside the Lord Chancellor's offices, in the sharp January air, the world was going on in its ordinary way. Carriages moved. People walked. London continued its enormous, indifferent business of being London. Alara stood on the steps and breathed. Caspian stood beside her. Not touching. They were still in public, still on the steps of a government building, still surrounded by solicitors and clerks and the machinery of formal proceedings. But close. The specific closeness of someone who has positioned himself deliberately, who wants the proximity to be felt even if it cannot, yet, be anything further. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at the street, at the ordinary, extraordinary January morning, at the people going about their lives in the particular way that people go about their lives, when they don't know that the world has just shifted on its axis for someone nearby. "It's over," she said, testing the words, seeing how they fit. "The legal portion," Caspian said carefully. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had been accumulating for weeks, the unguarded one, the one that existed before he could arrange it into something more contained. He looked like a man who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive and is standing in it now and is not entirely certain what the protocol requires. "You said," she began, in the January street. "You said to ask you when this was finished." "I did," she confirmed. "It is finished." "It is." He looked at her for a long moment, there on the steps of the Lord Chancellor's offices in the January cold, with London going about its business around them, and the green silk dress and the pearl necklace, and everything that had led to this particular morning assembled behind her like a completed story. "Alara Voss," he said, with the formal precision of a man who has been preparing this question for 10 years and is taking it seriously, "when sufficient time has passed for the dust to settle, and your life to become genuinely, entirely your own, will you allow me to court you? With your full knowledge, your full participation, and your complete authority to refuse me at any point and for any reason." She looked at him. She thought about a boy with a star chart and a girl in summer grass. She thought about a carriage sent before she'd agreed to get in. She thought about not one condition, and I should have shown you the ledger and shirt sleeves in a January street and the full, completed shape of everything she had learned about what it looked like when someone chose you freely. "Yes," she said, simply, without qualification or caveat, without the careful hedging that fear produces. The smile that moved through his face was the same one she had seen in the street, complete and undefended and devastating. And she thought, not for the first time, that it was extraordinarily unfair that he had kept it so contained for so long when it looked like that. "Good," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. She almost reached for his hand. She stopped herself because they were still on a public step, because she was still a woman who had been the subject of considerable public attention and did not need to provide additional material, because there was time now, actual, genuine, uncontested time for everything that came next. "Take me home," she said. And then, because it needed clarifying, because she was done with ambiguity, to Ashimore. "I would like to sit in the library and not think about any of this for several consecutive hours." "That," he said, "I can absolutely arrange." She laughed, and he offered his arm, and she took it, and London went on around them, bright and cold and full of its own enormous concerns, while above it the January sky stretched blue and clear and wider than anything, and two people walked down the steps of the Lord Chancellor's offices into the ordinary, extraordinary morning of what came after. Spring came to London the way it always did, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day in late February, convincing enough to make you believe, followed by a week of cold that reminded you that winter did not relinquish its hold without negotiation. Then a morning in March when the light arrived at a different angle than it had the morning before, and you understood, in some pre-rational part of yourself, that something had genuinely shifted, that the long dark had made its decision. Alara's 25th birthday fell on the 12th of March, on one of those argumentative days, cold in the morning, warm by afternoon, the kind of day that cannot make up its mind and ends up being both things at once, which she thought was entirely appropriate. She spent the morning with Reeves, signing documents. There were a great many of them. The formal transfer of the Voss estate from trustee to beneficiary required a volume of paperwork that she suspected was partly administrative necessity and partly the legal profession's way of ensuring the significance of a transaction was communicated through sheer physical weight. She signed her name 41 times. She counted, because counting was something to do with the part of her mind that wanted to feel the enormity of what was happening and needed a small, concrete task to keep it anchored. Alara Voss. 41 times. Her name returned to itself. By the afternoon, she was at the Wiltshire estate. Caspian had arranged to travel. Of course he had. He was constitutionally incapable of allowing a logistical detail to go unaddressed. But he had asked her, 2 days prior, whether she wanted company for the first visit or whether she needed to do it alone. He had asked it with the same careful, genuine attention to what she actually needed, that she had come to understand was not merely a quality he performed, but one he possessed in the way that some people possess perfect pitch or a gift for languages, naturally, without effort, as a function of simply being who he was. She had thought about it honestly. Both, she had said. I need to go in alone, but I would like you to be there. He had nodded, as though this were a completely sensible answer, which he supposed it was. He waited in the carriage at the end of the drive while she walked up to the house. It was smaller than memory had made it. This was always the way with childhood places. They exist in the mind at a scale proportional to the child who experienced them, enormous and absolute, and return to their actual dimensions only when adult eyes measure them against adult understanding. The house was modest, a comfortable, well-proportioned manor with good bones, and the slightly neglected air of a property that has been managed at a distance for 4 years by someone whose interest in it was financial rather than emotional. The garden was the worst of it. She stood at the edge of what had been her mother's garden and looked at 4 years of insufficient attention expressed in overgrown beds and unpruned roses, and the particular sadness of something that had been beautiful and had been let go. She was going to fix it. All of it. She was going to bring in a gardener who understood what the beds had been and could restore them, and she was going to have the house itself gone over room by room, and she was going to stand in her father's study and sit at his desk and be in the place where he had lived without the weight of Edmund's management pressing down on everything. She was going to do all of this. But first she simply stood in the garden and let herself feel the full, complicated substance of being here, the grief of what had been lost, the anger at how it had been managed, and beneath both of those, something quieter and more durable, something that was simply hers, the specific, irreducible fact of belonging to a place and having it belong to you. After a while she went back to the carriage. Caspian was reading. He was always reading when he had a spare moment, a habit she found endearing and had recently begun to tease him about, to which he responded with the particular dignified composure of a man pretending to be above teasing while clearly enjoying it. He looked up when she opened the door. She got in. She sat beside him rather than across, something she had started doing recently, a small and deliberate closing of the particular distance that had defined the early weeks, a physical punctuation of the thing that was developing between them in the proper, careful, fully participated in way they had agreed upon. Well, he said. It's smaller than I remembered, she said. The garden is a disaster. The south-facing windows need resealing. There is a great deal of work to do. He waited. I am very glad to be here, she said. He looked at her. Something warm and quiet moved through his expression. Good, he said. She looked out the carriage window at the Wiltshire afternoon, the fields beginning to show the first tentative green of early spring, the sky wide and pale and full of moving cloud. She thought about all the distances between here and where she had been geographical, temporal, the distance between who she had been in that ivory silk gown and who she was now in her own coat on her own land, with her own name signed 41 times on the papers that made it legally indisputable. Edmund, she said. Not a question. She had been thinking about it periodically. In the deliberate, managed way she had learned to think about things that had the potential to take up more space than she wanted to give them. The fraud charges are proceeding, Caspian said. He had kept her informed, as promised, of every development. His solicitor is attempting to negotiate a settlement. Reeves believes the Crown will not accept one. The evidence is too complete, and there are apparently other instances of similar conduct that are emerging as a consequence of the investigation. A pause. He will not escape this, Ilara. She absorbed this. She thought about Edmund's face in the hearing room, the composed, iron-controlled face of a man who had spent a lifetime arranging outcomes and who was watching the mechanism finally, permanently fail. She thought about what she felt toward him now that the legal proceedings had concluded and the anger had had time to cool into something more settled. She found she did not want his destruction. Not actively. She wanted her own life, wanted it fully, wanted to inhabit it completely, wanted to be done spending her energy on the man who had tried to steal it. His destruction was a legal matter now, proceeding through its proper channels, and she was content to leave it there. "I don't want to think about Edmund today," she said. "It's my birthday." Caspian's expression shifted into that almost smile. A sound position. "I think," she said, "that I would like to have dinner in the house. My house. For the first time." She paused. "If you would stay." The particular quality of stillness that moved through him was one she recognized now. The specific version that meant he was feeling something he was taking a moment to fully receive before responding to. "I would like that very much," he said. They had dinner in the dining room with its slightly musty smell of disuse, and its table that was too large for two people, and its chandelier that needed cleaning, and its windows that showed the Wiltshire garden going dark in the early spring evening. Mrs. Alderton had packed a hamper, had insisted on it, with the firm generosity of a woman who understood that significant days required proper food, and they ate by candlelight and talked in the way they had been talking for months now, the real way, the kind that doesn't require effort and doesn't leave you tired. Caspian told her about his own childhood memories of the house, the summers here with her father, the specific quality of those long days that had no obligation attached to them, which he said he had not fully appreciated until they were over, as one rarely does. She told him about her mother, who had been dead since Ilara was 9 and who existed now only in the garden and in certain gestures that Ilara sometimes caught herself making and recognized as inherited. He listened with the full attention that was his particular gift, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said, holding it with the care of someone who understands that the things people choose to tell you are not always the things they find easiest to say. After dinner, they walked in the garden. The evening was cold, but not harshly so, the soft cold of early spring, which has lost winter's edge, but hasn't yet found summer's warmth. The sky above Wiltshire was extraordinary, away from London's obscuring light, deep and clear and crowded with stars, the Milky Way visible as a smudge of light across the darkness, the familiar constellations arranged in their ancient patterns overhead. Ilara stopped walking and looked up. Beside her, she heard Caspian also stop. "Also look up." "Orion," she said, finding it immediately, the 3-starred belt and the surrounding figure unmistakable in the clear country sky. "Correctly identified," he said. "On the first attempt." "I always find him first," she said. "He's the easiest." "Is he?" Not a challenge. The tone of someone enjoying a familiar conversation that has found a new version of itself. "You still angle the shoulders wrong in your mental image," she said. "I noticed it in your annotation. You have him slightly rotated." A pause. "I annotated that book 30 years ago. The error remains current," she said pleasantly. "You are," he said with great dignity, "an extremely exacting person." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have factored that in." She felt him turn to look at her. And she turned too, there in the cold Wiltshire garden, with Orion overhead and the house behind them and the garden her mother had planted going slowly wild around them. And she found his expression in the starlight, that expression, the undefended one, the one that looked like the whole of what he felt arranged simply on his face, without management or containment. "Ilara," he said. "Yes," she said, not in answer to an unasked question, but as a statement, a position. The simplest possible expression of where she was, right now in this garden, in this life that was beginning to feel genuinely like hers. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not as a prelude to something. Simply, her hand in his in the cold spring dark, the most ordinary and profound gesture in the world. She held on. "I would like to ask you something," he said. Her heart performed a specific and involuntary maneuver. We agreed that you would ask when sufficient time had passed, she said carefully. It has been approximately 2 months. I am aware, he said. I would argue, however, that we have known each other for 30 years, and that the 2 months represents the final portion of a significantly longer acquaintance. She considered this. That is a reasonable argument. I thought so. A breath. Ilara Voss. You are the most precise, most courageous, most infuriatingly correct person I have ever known, and I have spent the better portion of my adult life in the particular discomfort of loving you from an insufficient distance. I would like very much to stop doing that. He paused. Will you marry me? Not because of circumstance or convenience or any pressure beyond the fact that I love you completely and would like to spend whatever time I have left being in the same room as you. She stood in the garden her mother had planted and looked at the man who had drawn her in the margins of a star chart and sent a carriage before she'd agreed to get in, and stood in a January street in his shirt sleeves, and said we without noticing, and who was looking at her now, with everything he felt entirely visible, nothing held back, nothing managed, the full and extraordinary thing simply present between them. She thought about what she had wanted, in the deepest and most honest part of herself, for a very long time. Not safety, exactly. Safety was a prerequisite, not a destination. Not rescue. She had rescued herself in every way that mattered, and Caspian had known this, and had helped her do it rather than doing it for her. What she had wanted, she understood now, was this. Exactly this. Someone who saw her clearly, and chose her deliberately, and made no secret of either. Yes, she said. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for quite some time. Perhaps 30 years. She wouldn't have been surprised. You were certain I'd say yes, she said. I was not, he said, with complete honesty. I was hopeful. There is a difference. You're right, she said. There is. He lifted her hand, the one he was still holding, the cold one, the one she had pressed to a hackney window on a December morning what felt like a different lifetime. And he pressed his lips to it with a formality that was also the opposite of formal. That was the most personal thing she had ever witnessed. She thought about the cathedral, about the ivory silk and the scattered pearls and the cold December air on her bare shoulders, and the specific quality of the silence of 200 people who did not move. She thought about how none of it had broken her, about how she had walked through it and out the other side and arrived here, in her mother's garden under Wiltshire stars, with her name on 41 documents, and her father's estate restored and a strand of pearls at her throat, and a man who had stood in a January street without his coat and told her the truth. They had tried to make her nothing. They had stripped away the dress and the veil and the carefully maintained composure, and what had been underneath was not what they had anticipated. What had been underneath was the part of her they could not touch, the part that had walked in the snow, and gotten into a carriage, and sat up straight in a Lord Chancellor's hearing room, and signed her name 41 times, and come home. She looked up at Orion. She thought about a girl in summer grass with her chin on her knees, looking at something outside the frame with concentrated attention. She thought that the girl had been right to look so carefully, that the thing worth attending to had been there all along, waiting with the patient certainty of something that knows it is true. Come inside, she said. It's cold. Yes, he agreed. They walked back toward the house, her house, in her name, with its dusty chandelier, and its overgrown garden, and its south-facing windows that needed resealing, and its dining room table too large for 2 people that would, she thought, require a great deal of future use to justify its dimensions. The candles in the dining room were still burning, visible through the windows, warm and specific against the dark. London would talk. London always talked. There would be announcements and arrangements and all the formal machinery of 2 people deciding to join their lives in the way that their particular world required. The engagement notice, the settlements, the inevitable social navigation of a story that had been so publicly begun and was now equally publicly concluding in a manner that nobody who had watched the cathedral performance could have entirely predicted. Let them talk. Let them construct their narratives and adjust their prior certainties, and find in this ending whatever lesson their particular understanding required. She was finished managing what they thought. She had spent enough of herself on that particular project. She pushed open the door of her house and stepped into the warmth and the candlelight, and Caspian followed her in, and the door closed behind them both with a sound that was not at all like a cathedral door closing, not a verdict, not a finality, not an ending. A beginning, quiet and certain and entirely, completely theirs. Outside, above the Wiltshire garden, Orion stood in his ancient position in the winter sky, shoulders slightly wrong, as they had always been, as they would always be, while the stars turned their slow, patient circles around the fixed point of the north, and the cold spring night held everything gently, and the world that had tried to burn her down discovered what she had always known about herself. She did not burn. She endured. She rebuilt. She chose. And in the warm light of her own house, with her own name and her own life and the whole of the future arranged before her like a map of a country she had not yet explored but was no longer afraid to enter, Ilaravas, who had stood stripped and shivering on cathedral steps and walked into the snow with nothing but her own stubborn, unbreakable self, was at last exactly where she had always deserved to be. Home.